Part 1. The Boy from the Isle of Wight. Born of salt and wind, the year was 1635, and the wind swept fiercely across the rocky shores of the Isle of Wight. In the small parish of Freshwater, a child was born into a world both wondrous and cruel. His name, Robert Hooke. His father, John Hooke, was the curate of the local churchman of stern voice and steady faith. The Hooke family was neither wealthy nor prestigious, but they held respect in the community. Robert was the youngest of 4 children, and from the beginning he was different. He was frail, sickly, the kind of child many feared would not survive into adulthood. His bones ached, his head throbbed, and he was prone to mysterious ailments. But in his weakness there was something else seen, unquenchable fire in his eyes, a restlessness, a hunger to know. While other boys played in the fields or chased gulls by the sea, Robert stared at the gears of the village clock. He studied the turning of the tides. He dismantled his father's timepieces and tried often successfully to put them back together. His mind was already seeking patterns in the chaos. The quiet painter. As Robert's body struggled to grow, he found comfort in stillness. With a piece of charcoal or a quill pen, he could spend hours copying the bark of a tree, the veining of a leaf, or the face of a fellow parishioner. His sketches were not just art, they were observation, detail, and analysis. His hand recorded what his mind wanted to understand. It was soon clear to his family that Robert had an unusual talent for portraiture. He could replicate reality with such fine detail that some considered it uncanny. But what they didn't see was that Robert was not merely drawing, he was dissecting the visible world, one line at a time. He watched how light curved around corners, how shadows shifted, how the breeze altered the surface of water. He had no teacher, no formal instruction. The world was his mentor, and he its most attentive student. Death and departure. When Robert was 13, his world changed forever. His father, John Hooke, passed away suddenly. For a boy already fragile in body, the loss struck like a thunderclap. But it also did something else. It set him free. His inheritance was small, but just enough to leave the island and travel to London. There, with his portfolio of drawings under his arm and a heart full of questions, Robert hoped to make something of himself. He was not yet a scientist, not yet a philosopher, not yet a name in any book. But he was ready to become all of those things. London and the world of men. The London of the 1640s was a place of contradiction. The English Civil War loomed on the horizon, but the city remained a hub of commerce, learning, and art. It was here that Robert apprenticed under Peter Lely, one of the era's most prominent portrait painters. Hooke learned to mix paints, stretch canvas, and balance composition. But more than that, he honed his sense of precision, a quality that would serve him far beyond the artist's studio. Yet as weeks turned to months, Hooke grew restless. Portraits were fascinating, yes, but they were still, lifeless, predictable. He yearned to understand the machinery of life, not just its image. It was then that a chance encounter changed everything. Doors to discovery. Robert met a man who recognized his talent, not just his eye, but his mind. That man was John Wilkins, a scholar and clergyman who believed in uniting science with theology. Wilkins introduced Hooke to the great world of ideas, mathematics, astronomy, and natural philosophy. With Wilkins' help, Hooke was admitted to Westminster School, and from there he progressed to Oxford University. There, in the ancient halls of learning, he would meet the minds that would shape his destiny: Robert Boyle, Christopher Wren, and eventually Isaac Newton. Hooke became an assistant to Boyle, a role far beneath his ambition, but perfect for his skill set. He cleaned equipment, prepared materials, ran air pump experiments, and observed. Always observed. To Boyle, Hooke was a loyal helper. To Hooke, Boyle was a stepping stone, the awakening of a mind. At Oxford, Hooke devoured books like a starving man devours bread. He studied mechanics, chemistry, astronomy, architecture, and the new science of optics. He experimented with prisms and lenses, built pendulums and clocks, and tested ideas others deemed too strange to pursue. He was fascinated by the very small and the very large, by atoms and planets, by the invisible forces that held the cosmos together and the delicate structures that formed life itself. He no longer painted with pigment. He painted with ideas. His brush was made of equations. His canvas was reality. The boy from the island had become a man of inquiry, and the world had no idea what was about to be revealed through his eyes. The world within the world. Hooke's interest turned toward lenses, not to look outward at stars, but inward into the hidden architecture of the world. He spent months perfecting his own microscopes, grinding lenses by hand, experimenting with light and curvature. What he saw under the lens would astonish him and the world. A thin slice of cork, examined at high magnification, revealed a patterned boxy compartments, like tiny rooms in a monastery. Hooke called them cells. He did not yet know these were the building blocks of life, but he had given the invisible a name, and in doing so, he had begun the field of cellular biology. From apprentice to architect of thought, the child who had once copied the textures of bark now revealed its microscopic skeleton. The apprentice who cleaned Boyle's instruments now built better ones. The young painter who once captured faces now captured reality itself, on scales no human had seen before. Hooke would go on to publish Micrographia, revolutionize our understanding of elasticity, explore the stars, build bridges and buildings, and challenge the greatest minds of his time. But it all began with a sickly child, with a sketchbook and a question, with a microscope and a moment of awe. Part 2. The Young Artist. The city of shadows and light. London in the mid-17th century was a city of contradictions. Its narrow streets bustled with merchants, priests, philosophers, and paupers. Buildings leaned precariously against one another, while gossip and smoke swirled through alleyways. Above the filth and fire, towers reached for the heavens, a promise that reason and revelation might one day meet. Into this chaos stepped Robert Hooke, barely 14, alone and armed with nothing but a modest inheritance and a portfolio of sketches. He arrived with no grand plan, only a relentless desire to understand, to create, and perhaps, though he wouldn't admit it, the remembered. The workshop of Sir Peter Lely. Through a family connection and some fortunate timing, Hooke found himself apprenticed to Sir Peter Lely, court painter to the aristocracy, and a man who knew how to turn beauty into currency. Lely was flamboyant and demanding, but he saw something in Hooke's work, something mechanical in its precision, but also alive with curiosity. Hooke wasn't the most expressive artist, but his detail was unmatched. He could copy a nose's curve or a velvet's fold with uncanny fidelity. For 2 years, Robert learned the techniques of the portrait trade, grinding pigments, stretching canvas, managing light and shadow, perfecting human proportions. But even then, he was not quite content. When the other apprentices mocked him for drawing flies with more passion than duchesses, he simply shrugged. "The fly," he muttered, "is far more interesting." Beyond flesh and paint, what separated Hooke from his peers was not skill but intent. They painted to please. He painted to understand. He'd trace the vascular web of a leaf or the grain in wood, and then take it apart to see why it appeared that way. He made studies not only of appearances, but of function. A curled leaf, he'd ask, what pressure caused it to bend? A shadow on fabric? What angle of light? What surface tension? It was art, yes, but also analysis. The foundation of scientific observation was being laid stroke by stroke, long before he would ever set foot in a laboratory. Music of machines. Hooke's eye for harmony soon translated into a love for mechanical devices. he began to draw not just portraits, but diagram pulleys, gears, levers, lenses. He fashioned small automata, moving parts powered by twisted rope or gravity, much to the amusement of Lely's household and the horror of his fellow apprentices. His mind swirled with motion. In paint he found limitation. In mechanism he found liberation. By age 16, Hooke was no longer satisfied to remain in the studio. He needed tools, books, formulas, and ideas. He needed mentors who would challenge his assumptions, not ask him to paint their wives. He left Lely's workshop with little fanfare. The city had more to teach him. Entry into Westminster School. Robert Hooke's artistic discipline opened the door to Westminster School, one of the most prestigious institutions in London. His talent and eagerness impressed Dr. Richard Busby, a stern yet intellectually generous headmaster. Under Busby's rigorous training, Hooke immersed himself in Latin, Greek, geometry, and logic disciplines essential to the world of learning. For the first time, Hooke encountered the formal structures of Euclidean geometry and the poetic motion of planetary spheres described by Ptolemy and Copernicus. He found that the logic he had long practiced unconsciously as an artist could be expressed numerically and spatially. He also began to see himself as more than just a curious boy. He could speak mathematics, debate physics, and grasp abstract relationships. He was, at last, an intellectual. Encounter with John Wilkins. At Westminster, Hooke's life took another pivotal turn. He met John Wilkins, a polymath, theologian, and one of the founding minds behind what would soon become the Royal Society of London. Wilkins believed that the study of the natural world was not an affront to God, but a celebration of his creation. Wilkins saw Hooke's dual gift, technical skill and theoretical insight, and encouraged him to pursue studies in Oxford, where the spirit of experimental science was beginning to stir. Under Wilkins' guidance, Hooke was introduced to the idea of natural philosophia worldview, where logic, mathematics, observation, and reason could be applied to the mysteries of nature. It was as if a locked door had suddenly opened inside Hooke's mind. He would not just copy Naturi, would decode it. Aravel at Oxford. Armed with letters of introduction and the backing of Wilkins and Busby, Robert Hooke entered Christ Church, Oxford in the early 1650s. He was not wealthy, nor noble, and held no scholarship, but his reputation preceded him. Oxford was a hotbed of inquiry. Thinkers like Thomas Willis, Christopher Wren, John Wallis, and Robert Boyle filled the air with speculation about vacuums, alchemy, and the movement of celestial bodies. Hooke found himself drawn both intellectually and practically to Robert Boyle, the aristocratic scientist who was attempting to demonstrate the nature of air, pressure, and combustion. Boyle needed a technician, Hooke needed a laboratory. It was the perfect match. The artist becomes an engineer. Working in Boyle's lab, Hooke applied his artistic mastery of detail and construction to scientific instruments. He designed air pumps, thermometers, and vacuum chambers. He refined Boyle's air pump apparatus, which helped prove that air had weight and could be manipulated in controlled experiments. What other apprentices accomplished through repetition, Hooke accomplished through invention. He quickly gained a reputation not only as Boyle's assistant, but as his intellectual equal. He asked questions Boyle hadn't thought of. He modified devices with surprising insight. He didn't just perform Boyle's experiments, she elevated them. Though his name was not always mentioned in Boyle's publications, Hooke's fingerprints were all over the scientific results. The mind that could not be contained. While many students at Oxford remained confined to a single discipline, Hooke's curiosity exploded across boundaries. By night, he sketched anatomical diagrams. By day, he experimented with light refraction, pendulums, and materials under stress. He built his own compound microscopes, adjusting curvature and magnification, and began observing insects, feathers, molds, crystals, and most famously cork. The artist in him had never left. It simply now worked through lenses and levers rather than brush and canvas. He saw not just forms, but functions. He saw laws beneath structure. Robert Hooke had discovered not only the unseen, but the principles that governed it. Toward the micrographia, in a corner of his Oxford room, surrounded by brass instruments, lenses, and piles of papers, Hooke began assembling a manuscript. His observations, drawings, theories, and questions organized into a single revolutionary work. It would be called Micrographia Book that would change the way humans viewed their world. But before it would be published, Robert Hooke would become the curator of experiments for the newly founded Royal Society, a title that would give him access, power, and eventually conflict. And as the next phase of his life began, Hooke's past as a young artist would not fad it, would become the very foundation of how he saw the universe. Part 3. The Oxford Years. The Laboratory of Wonders. Oxford in the early 1650s was a city in transition not only politically but intellectually. While Parliament and monarchy jostled for control, a quieter revolution was unfolding inside the colleges and libraries. A revolution of reason. Hooke found himself at the heart of this movement. Christ Church was no ordinary place of learning. It was a crucible where faith, philosophy, and experimentation collided. The students debated Aristotle and Galileo with equal passion. Many were fascinated not by dogma, but by the mechanics of the natural world. Hooke, newly arrived, had no fortune and little social standing, but he had two critical assets: unrivaled skill with instruments and a mind alive with questions. Enter Robert Boyle. One of Oxford's most influential figures at the time was Robert Boyle, a brilliant Anglo-Irish scientist and heir to the Earl of Cork. Boyle believed that nature was God's book, waiting to be read with logic and experimentation. Boyle had money, vision, and theories, but he needed hands. Skilled hands, inventive hands. Enter Robert Hooke. At first, Hooke's job was purely mechanical: build an improved air pump for Boyle's vacuum experiments. But what began as assistance quickly turned into collaboration. Hooke redesigned parts, strengthened glass chambers, and created mechanisms to regulate pressure more accurately. He even invented a new mercurial barometer using capillary action and a glass siphon. Boyle soon realized this was no ordinary assistant. This was a co-architect of discovery. Discovering the invisible air. Together, Hooke and Boyle performed a series of groundbreaking experiments on the properties of air. Could sound travel through a vacuum? Could a flame survive without air? Could animals breathe in evacuated chambers? With Hooke managing the pumps and calibrating delicate instruments, Boyle observed and recorded. They discovered that air had elasticity. It could be compressed. It was essential for life. Boyle later published new experiments, physico-mechanical, touching the spring of the air, often referred to as the foundation of gas laws. While Hooke's name appeared only in passing, those who watched the experiments knew Hooke made them possible. The experience left Hooke with mixed feelings, respect for Boyle's brilliance, but also a growing desire to prove himself independently. The awakening of a scientific philosopher. The more Hooke experimented, the more he questioned. He wondered not only what things did, but why they did them. His interests expanded quickly. How did pendulums maintain regular time? What caused colors in thin films of soap? Could a spring be used instead of a weight to keep a watch ticking? Why did light bend through lenses? He built clocks, microscopes, water pumps, even wind-powered automata. His knowledge deepened across mechanics, optics, chemistry, and biology. By 1658, Hooke was one of Oxford's most capable natural philosophers, despite lacking a degree. The university's hierarchy may have dismissed him as a technician, but fellow thinkers, like Christopher Wren and John Wilkins, saw the truth. The first curator of experiments. In 1660, The Royal Society of London for Improving Natural Knowledge was formally established an institution devoted to experimental science. Wilkins, Wren, Boyle, and others were among its first members. When the society needed a man to conduct regular public experiments who could build machines, test theories, and explain results, they had only one real choice: Robert Hooke. In 1662, Hooke was appointed the Curator of Experiments. This was a job of extraordinary scope. Each week, Hooke had to present new findings, demonstrate inventions, test hypotheses, entertain debates. He was not merely a contributor. He became the engine that drove the Royal Society, and he had only just begun. The birth of Hooke's law. Hooke's work in mechanics soon led him to explore the properties of springs and elasticity. While experimenting with coils, bands, and metal wires, he noticed a pattern. The force required to extend or compress a spring is proportional to the distance it is stretched. He formalized this in Latin: ut tensio, sic vis, as the extension, so the force. This became known as Hooke's Law foundation of modern physics and engineering. It describes how elastic materials behave under force and is still used today in countless applications, from architecture to aerospace. What made Hooke's discovery remarkable was not just the law, it was the way he arrived at it. Through hundreds of carefully designed trials, he extracted a universal principle from ordinary motion. This was the essence of Hooke's genius, seeing the cosmic in the commonplace. Conflict and control. As Hooke's reputation grew, so did his resentment toward aristocratic scientists who claimed glory while overlooking practical laborers. He was keenly aware of class divisions and intellectual snobbery. He believed, often correctly, that many discoveries attributed to others had relied on his designs or insights. His relationships with Boyle and later Newton would suffer because of this. Hooke became fiercely protective of his ideas. He developed the habit of publishing anagrams or riddles to announce discoveries without revealing their nature, such as his spring law, which he initially published in cipher. This defensiveness made him seem paranoid to some, but in an era where priority meant prestige. Hooke was fighting for his place in history. Observing light and color. Hooke was not satisfied with just mechanics. His passion turned next to light. He experimented with refraction, reflection, and interference, observing how thin films produced rainbow-like colors. He proposed that light behaved like a wavy, bold idea, long before it gained acceptance. He also built powerful compound microscopes, applying his understanding of glass, lens curvature, and alignment. Using these instruments, he began a journey that would forever change biology. He observed fleas with jaws like razors and legs like armor, lice wriggling with alien energy, feathers appearing as forests of delicate branches, snowflakes, perfect six-pointed stars. And then he turned his attention to plant material. The revelation in cork. In one experiment, Hooke sliced a piece of cork and placed it under his microscope. What he saw stunned him. The structure appeared compartmentalized, a lattice of small, empty boxes. He likened them to monks' cells in a monastery. Though unaware of their true biological function, Hooke had discovered what we now call the fundamental building blocks of life. This observation would become one of the most important moments in the history of biology. It was the artist's eye and the engineer's precision that made the discovery possible. The writing of Micrographia. In 1665, Hooke published his greatest work, Micrographia, part scientific treatise, part artistic marvel. The book featured detailed illustrations of microscopic observations and speculative essays on combustion, light, and motion. It was the first major scientific bestseller in England. The public was amazed. Hooke became a household name. King Charles II himself requested demonstrations. Hooke had brought the unseen world into the light and, in doing so, placed himself at the forefront of a new scientific age. The Oxford Years Remembered. Years later, as Hooke walked the corridors of Gresham College, now professor of geometry and curator of the Royal Society, he would sometimes reflect on his time at Oxford. He had entered as a penniless assistant. He had left as one of England's most influential thinkers. He owed much to Boyle, Wilkins, and Wren, but more than Thayth owed it to his own tenacity. The boy who once painted flies had now seen into their very structure. The apprentice who built air pumps had discovered the laws of elasticity. The artist had become a scientist, and Yeathie's greatest challenges still lay ahead. Part 4. The Experimental Philosopher. The Pulse of the Royal Society. London, 1665. The air was thick with ideas and with plague. As the Royal Society's curator of experiments, Robert Hooke stood at the epicenter of scientific discovery. From within the halls of Gresham College, he orchestrated a dazzling array of demonstrations that would shape the course of natural philosophy for generations to come. Each week, members gathered, gentlemen, noblemen, clergymento, witness experiments that touched the limits of human understanding. And at the center of every lecture, every astonishment, stood Hooke, chalk in hand, microscope focused, contraptions hissing, springs coiling, pendulums swinging. He had become the living engine of England's scientific revolution. Curator of curiosity. As curator, Hooke had a unique responsibility to entertain and educate, but this was not a theaterit, was methodical revelation. His experiments explored the weight of air, the expansion of metals, the strength of materials, the nature of fire and combustion, the motion of pendulums and springs, the transmission of sound, the effects of freezing and heating. What he lacked in formal prestige, Hooke made up for in sheer brilliance and energy. His laboratory became a stage, his inventions the props of an infinite play of phenomena. Every instrument was handmade, every lens ground with obsessive care. His notebooks overflowed, drawings, equations, fragments of theories. For Hooke, to explain the world was not merely a goal, it was a compulsion. Architecture of motion. Beyond small-scale phenomena, Hooke became fascinated with the movement of large bodies, planets, pendulums, projectiles. He began proposing laws of motion, that bodies in motion remain so unless acted upon. That circular motion results from a central force, that gravity weakens with distance. These were ideas centuries ahead of their time, forming the framework later perfected by Isaac Newton. Hooke's challenge was not a lack of insight, but the inability to formalize mathematically what he deeply intuited. He suspected correctly that the inverse square law governed planetary attraction, but without calculus he struggled to prove it. Hooke shared these insights with Newton, and so began one of the most bitter feuds in scientific history. Enemy of Newton. Hooke and Newton were opposites in temperament and method. Hooke, observational, inventive, hands-on, socially awkward, emotionally intense. Newton, solitary, abstract, mathematical, politically cautious, ruthlessly strategic. When Newton published his theory of gravitation, Hooke immediately recognized ideas they had discussed and accused Newton of intellectual theft. Newton, in turn, dismissed Hooke as a mechanic, a mere tinkerer, lacking deep understanding. The conflict escalated. Letters turned to insults. Hooke's name was omitted from Newton's Principia. Newton eventually became president of the Royal Society, and Hooke's influence began to fade. After Hooke's death, Newton reportedly destroyed or suppressed the only known portrait of Hooke. It was an act of erasure, and it would take centuries to correct. But during this conflict, Hooke continued to produce unstoppable, undeterred. Master of mechanisms. In these years, Hooke constructed hundreds of instruments, barometers and thermometers with enhanced precision, the universal joint for flexible motion, hygrometers to measure humidity, clock escapements and balances for timekeeping, telescopes with improved focusing mechanisms, even concepts for diving bells and flying machines. One of his greatest contributions was his balance spring mechanism for watches, allowing for portable and reliable timekeeping, essential for navigation and astronomy. He competed with Christian Huygens over credit for this invention. Hooke didn't just theorize, he built, and through his inventions, he changed not only science, but the very way people lived and measured the world. The philosopher of architecture. Following the Great Fire of London in 1666, the city was devastated. Over 13,000 homes burned, along with St. Paul's Cathedral and countless landmarks. Christopher Wren was appointed to lead the city's rebuilding. But who worked beside him? Robert Hooke. Hooke served as city surveyor. He helped redesign London's street plan, supervise building standards, and create more fire-resistant designs. Together with Wren, he helped build the monument to the Great Fire. Hooke designed it to double as a telescope. St. Paul's Cathedral. Dozens of churches, halls, and bridges. Hooke's architectural achievements are often overshadowed, but his contributions helped redefine London's skyline. Death in the air. In addition to his architecture and mechanics, Hooke remained obsessed with air. He studied respiration, sound propagation, barometric pressure. He proposed that air was composed of tiny particles in motion, a precursor to molecular theory. He examined lungs, dissected birds, and speculated that oxygen, though not yet named, was essential to combustion and life. He even described capillary action, noting how water climbed narrow tubes, a mystery later explained by fluid dynamics. Hooke, once again, was decades ahead. Plague, panic, and perseverance. During the plague outbreak, Hooke observed how disease spread. He wore a wax coat, carried vinegar, and recorded weather patterns, believing humidity and air pressure played a role. He proposed building sealed environments to slow contagion, an idea now echoed in quarantine design. Despite fear and superstition, Hooke never retreated. He kept observing, recording, experimenting. While others fled the city, Hooke stayed to witness the invisible. The philosopher of observation. More than anything, Hooke was a seer not of visions, but of structure and principle. He observed how a louse's claws curved to grip hair, how a needle could puncture light in diffraction patterns, how frost formed in crystal branches on glass, how muscular effort could be modeled by levers and pulleys. His genius was his relentless attention to detail, matched with the courage to generalize. He often worked alone, sleeping irregularly, skipping meals. His health suffered. He complained of migraines, melancholy, poor digestion. Yet he kept working. Every living thing, every gear, every beam of light, studied them all. A universe without magic. Hooke believed that the universe could be explained through natural laws, not superstition. He viewed the soul as a function of motion and matter, not divine spark. He was not an atheist, but neither did he cling to miracles. He declared that nature is a mechanic. Her work is predictable. Her laws are hidden, not mystical. This rationalism put him at odds with religious scientists, but it also made him a prophet of modern science. He separated medicine from mysticism, astronomy from astrology, physics from metaphysics. Hooke helped lay the foundations of empirical reasoning. The mind that changed the world. As Hooke entered his 50s, he had become England's most accomplished experimental philosopher. He had invented more than any man of his age. He had seen the infinitely small and theorized the infinitely large. But his name was fading from public memory. His feud with Newton had hurt him. His lack of social grace isolated him. His lack of published treatises limited his fame. Yet his influence remained embedded in every spring-driven device, every microscope, every weather barometer, every architectural blueprint of modern London, Every biology textbook that begins with the word cell, he had shown the world how to look and how to see. Part 5. The Discovery of the Cell. A World Too Small to See. By the mid-1660s, Robert Hooke had become a man obsessed with the unseen. He had built air pumps, calibrated thermometers, designed architectural wonders, but now he was chasing something far more elusive, the hidden structures of living matter. With his own hands, he ground lenses, adjusted barrels, and constructed one of the most advanced compound microscopes of his age. No longer content with mere observation of motion and weight, Hooke aimed to pierce the mystery of form and pattern. He believed that the universe, whether in stone or seed, was not chaos, but architecture, and he was determined to sketch its blueprint into the lens. The microscope Hooke used had multiple lenses, carefully aligned to focus and magnify images, but it was not perfect. Chromatic aberrations blurred edges. The light had to be just right. Hooke became an expert in light-engangling candles, mirrors, and sunlight to highlight texture. He sometimes spent hours on a single specimen, adjusting the flame, realigning the lens, sketching with surgical precision. He examined feathers, showing them not as smooth veins, but as rows of barbed branches, ice crystals, revealing fractal symmetry, needles, appearing like massive spears under magnification, mold spores, as globes floating on stalks. Each image was a revelation, the cork that changed everything. Then came the day when Hooke examined a piece of corca, simple, lightweight material used to seal bottles. He sliced it razor-thin with a hand-cut blade and mounted it on his microscope slide. As he peered through the eyepiece, he saw something he had never imagined, a matrix of tiny box-like chambers, hundreds of them, repeating in rows and columns like honeycombs. They looked like small rooms. Hooke, drawing on his architectural and ecclesiastical background, called them cells, after the monastic chambers where monks lived. I could exceedingly plainly perceive it to be all perforated and porous, much like a honeycomb. These pores or cells were not very deep, but consisted of a great many little boxes. These were, of course, plant cells, though Hooke did not know their biological function. He was seeing dead cell walls, remnants of once living tissue. Still, he had named what no one had seen before. He had given language to the invisible. He had opened a new kingdom of knowledge. Drawing the microscopic world, what Hooke lacked in formal theory, he made up for with unparalleled illustrations. He meticulously sketched every observation, blending artistry with science. His images were not just visual aids, they were scientific evidence, meant to reveal the truth to those who could not see directly. He drew the compound eye of a fly, the claw of a flea, the crystalline structure of snow, the lace-like delicacy of feathers. He annotated his drawings with hypotheses and commentary. They were scientific portraits of the sub-visible world. Hooke's artistic background now reached its full purpose, to reveal structure, not just beauty. Micrographia, the book that shook England. In 1665, Hooke published Micrographia, subtitled Some Physiological Descriptions of Minute Bodies Made by Magnifying Glasses. The book was unlike anything ever printed, bound in leather, filled with large fold-out plates, written in eloquent English. It was a marvel of science, art, and literature. It included detailed illustrations, theories on combustion and light, observations of artificial and natural objects, reflections on the cosmos and the atom. Hooke speculated that all matter was made of corpusclestiny particles obeying mechanical laws. He discussed refraction, diffraction, elasticity, and crystallization. But it was the microscopic illustrations that captivated the public. Science becomes popular. Micrographia was an immediate sensation. People marveled at the revelation that fleas were armored like knights, that needles were jagged like mountains, that paper was a forest of fibers. For the first time, the public could see what had always been beyond their senses. Hooke brought wonder into the parlors of gentlemen and the courts of kings. King Charles II himself was so fascinated that he invited Hooke to demonstrate his microscope at Whitehall. Hooke was no longer just a scientific worker, he had become a public intellectual, a celebrity of sorts. His name was now linked with curiosity, precision, and revelation. Beyond biology, Micrographia's broader impact, although famous for its biological content, Micrographia reached into physics, chemistry, and cosmology. Hooke proposed a wave theory of light, speculated on the composition of fire, examined combustion as a chemical process, described surface tension and capillarity. He theorized that heat was the motion of particles, foreshadowing kinetic theory. He proposed that fire was not a material element, but a processive view far ahead of his time. He mused that there might be other universes beyond ours, invisible due to their different properties. Each page of Micrographia was an explosion of curiosity. The limits of vision. Hooke pushed his microscope to its limits, but he also understood those limits. He admitted that imperfections in lenses caused distortions. He noted that many things still could not be seen clearly, such as the internal structure of living tissue or the movement of fluids within cells. Nevertheless, Hooke believed the future would bring better instruments. He envisioned lenses with greater precision, instruments with illumination control, new ways to observe motion at the microscopic level. He wrote, "By the help of microscopes there is nothing so small as to escape our inquiry, hence there is a new visible world discovered to the understanding." A legacy in biology. Hooke was not a biologist in the modern sense. He did not fully understand what a cell was. He did not propose the cell theory. But his naming of the cell created the conceptual groundwork for what would become. The cell theory, Schleiden and Schwann, 1838. Studies in microbiology, discoveries in genetics and virology, the entire field of molecular biology. He gave science the language to think about the fundamental unit of life. He turned organic complexity into geometric structure. He showed that even in death, living things had architecture. The immortal observation. In the closing pages of Micrographia, Hooke offered a kind of philosophical reflection meditation on the humility science demands. The more the microscope enlarges the objects, the more the imperfections of our senses are discovered. We see not with eyes only, but with judgment, with patience, and with care. It was a statement not of arrogance, but of awe. For Hooke, the microscope was not just an instrument, it was a portal, one that shattered the illusion of human centrality and invited us to wonder at the intricacy of creation. The moment he saw cells in cork, the world was forever changed. Part 6. Hooke's Law and Physics. The Science of Motion. By the late 1660s, Robert Hooke had peered into the smallest parts of nature, but now his eyes turned toward another kind of mystery motion. Motion of pendulums, of falling weights, of planets, and of springs. He wanted to understand why objects moved as they did, how force related to change, what invisible rules governed elasticity, tension, and pressure. He believed there were mathematical laws hidden beneath every observable effect, waiting to be discovered by experiment, expressed through geometry and proportion. And Hooke, ever the builder and observer, was ready to search for those laws, not with abstract theory, but with machines, levers, coils, and precision tools. The spring that spoke. One day, while observing a coiled metal spring, Hooke noticed something peculiar. The more force he applied to extend it, the farther it stretched, but in a consistent and predictable way. He began testing springs of various metals and sizes, extension measured against weight, restoring force as the spring recoiled, repetition under varying environmental conditions. Eventually, he saw a pattern emerge. The extension of the spring was proportional to the force applied up to a certain limit. He encapsulated this truth in a Latin phrase, published cryptically at first, "Attentio sic vis," as the extension, so the force. This would later be formalized as Hooke's law, F equals kx, force equals stiffness constant times extension. It was one of the first and most enduring formulations of linear elasticity in history. Experimentation, not just intuition. Hooke didn't stumble onto his law by guesswork. He engineered its discovery. He built custom weights and pulleys, designed scale systems to measure extension precisely, accounted for air temperature and metal fatigue, compared behavior across different substances. He was not merely observing but quantifying, turning motion into measurement. This empirical foundation would influence physics for centuries, serving as the basis for suspension systems, clock mechanisms, seismographs, airplane wings, space shuttle components. Anywhere something bends or stretches, Hooke is there. The ethics of priority. But Hooke had been burned before. Earlier ideas he shared openly about springs, about motion, about light had been taken up by others, such as Huygens, Newton, or Boyle, and sometimes claimed without credit. This time he played it carefully. Rather than immediately publish his findings, he encoded them. He released an anagram to the Royal Society, Stuf, later revealed to be Utensio sic vis. This tactic allowed him to stake a priority claim while retaining control over timing and context. It was a brilliant, if paranoid, move and reflected the cutthroat nature of 17th century science. Hooke didn't just discover laws, he had to defend them. Clocks, time, and navigation. One of Hooke's primary motivations for exploring spring mechanics was timekeeping. Pendulum clocks, like those perfected by Christian Huygens, were precise but not portable. They couldn't operate reliably on a ship. Hooke envisioned using a balanced spring coiled metal banto control the motion of a rotating wheel, creating a compact, reliable clock. This would become the basis for modern mechanical watches. He built prototypes, calibrated spring tensions, and tested their accuracy. He even proposed using spring-regulated timepieces for marine navigation, helping sailors calculate longitude at sea. Though Huygens would publish a similar idea and claim the invention, many historians now recognize Hooke's independent and earlier contributions. Pendulums and planetary paths. Hooke also studied pendulum motion, investigating how amplitude and period related to gravitational force. He realized that pendulums behave regularly regardless of mass, could be used as time-keeping instruments, demonstrate the conservation of energy. He then extended this thinking to planetary orbits. He hypothesized that planets move in curved paths because of a central force. The strength of this force diminishes with distance. Orbits may be elliptical, not perfect circles. He was describing, in rough form, the inverse square law of Gravit's law Newton would later formalize. Hooke even claimed he had discovered this idea earlier, but lacked the mathematical method to prove it. Correspondence with Newton. Hooke and Isaac Newton corresponded on celestial mechanics in the 1670s. Hooke suggested that gravity extends to the moon, that planetary motion is governed by centripetal forces, that a mathematical law governs gravitational pull. Newton, intrigued, revisited his own earlier theories, leading eventually to the development of universal gravitation and Philosophia Naturalis Principia Mathematica. But when Hooke asked for acknowledgement, Newton refused. Newton claimed his proofs were original and that Hooke had only guessed, not demonstrated. Hooke replied that he had provided the seed of the theory. Thus began a lifelong feud between two of the greatest minds in science, elasticity and engineering. Hooke applied his knowledge of springs and force to engineering problems. He advised architects and surveyors on building supports, bridges and domes, stress distribution in materials, earthquake-resistant structures. He tested stone under compression, metal under torsion, glass unter Tension. His writings on elasticity laid the groundwork for structural analysis, civil and mechanical engineering, material science. Hooke saw buildings as organic, subject to forces and fatigue. He believed understanding elasticity was key to preventing catastrophic collapse. He was centuries ahead of the safety standards we now take for granted. Tensions and recognition. Despite his brilliance, Hooke remained undervalued in elite circles. He was not a mathematician in the classical mold. He didn't publish grand treatises like Newton. His genius was in application, in demonstration, in real-world systems. Many of his discoveries appeared in Royal Society minutes, in lecture notes, or in collaborative work, making it easy for others to overlook or steal his priority. He fought back with vitriolic letters, cryptic ciphers, fierce lectures defending his ideas. He was, in some ways, his own worst enemy, brilliant but bristling, proud but isolated, an enduring law. Hooke's law is now taught in every physics and engineering classroom. It is embedded in seismic sensors, vehicle suspensions, robotics, skyscraper design, Sparts equipment, spacecraft structures. His equation, F equals kx, remains one of the simplest and most powerful expressions of nature's order. Though Hooke died with fewer honors than he deserved, his legacy is mathematical, mechanical, and eternal. The springs that drive our clocks, the materials that shape our buildings, the instruments that test our world all bear his imprint. He showed us that even in tension, there is truth. Part 7. Hooke the Astronomer. Eyes toward the heavens. Though most know Robert Hooke for his work with the microscope, his mind was equally drawn to the telescope. Where the microscope revealed the world within, the telescope promised a view of the world beyond. Just as Hooke crafted his own lenses to study the tiny, he soon began constructing his own telescopes to chase the stars. He believed that the laws which govern springs and pendulums might also govern planets and light. If nature was ordered, then the cosmos must follow rules just as measurable as those he had discovered in mechanics and elasticity. Rebuilding vision. Hooke was deeply dissatisfied with most telescopes of his time. He found them prone to optical distortion, unstable in long observation, vulnerable to atmospheric distortion. So he did what he always did, built a better one. He experimented with compound lenses to reduce chromatic aberration, telescopic mounts for steadier, long-term observation, focus mechanisms that allowed fine adjustment, mirrors and prisms to reflect and bend light precisely. One of his most audacious designs was the monument telescopy vertical shaft in a building he co-designed after the Great Fire of London that could serve in theory as an enormous zenithal telescope. Though the idea was never fully realized, it revealed Hooke's ambition to combine architecture with astronomy. Observing the moon, Hooke turned his telescopic gaze first to the moon. He carefully mapped its craters, plains, which he called seas, shadows and surface textures. Hooke's drawings of the lunar surface were among the most accurate of the 17th century. He speculated that the moon had mountains and valleys like Earth. Its craters might have been formed by volcanic activity. Some features shifted, suggesting a dynamic lunar surface. This went against the Aristotelian belief that heavenly bodies were unchanging. Hooke insisted that the moon was a world, not a perfect celestial sphere. Jupiter, Saturn, and beyond. Hooke next observed the planets. With Jupiter, he noted its bands of color, the changing appearance of its surface, the movement of a small dark spot, possibly an early observation of the Great Red Spot With Saturn, he sketched its handles, a puzzling feature at the time, which we now know as the rings of Saturn. He lacked the power to resolve them fully, but Hooke's notes suggest he suspected they were separate from the planet, orbiting rather than fixata hypothesis that would be confirmed by Christian Huygens. Comets and the structure of the cosmos. Hooke also observed comets, recording their trajectories, tails, brightness over time. He rejected the idea that comets were atmospheric phenomena and instead proposed they were celestial bodies with orbits. Hooke theorized that comets might follow elliptical or parabolic paths. They could be remnants of destroyed planets. Their tails were affected by solar heat and radiation. This was radical. It hinted that the solar system was not static, but in flux with objects moving under invisible forces. Light as a wave. Through both his telescopic and experimental work, Hooke grew increasingly convinced that light was not a stream of particles, as Descartes or Newton suggested, but a wave. He proposed light travels through a medium, an ether. Colors arise from interference and vibration, not intrinsic properties. Diffraction and reflection follow wave patterns. His arguments were published in Micrographia and later expanded in his lectures. Though Newton would dominate optics for a time with his corpuscular theory, later scientists Young and Maxwell would vindicate Hooke's wave model. Hooke had seen the motion behind the light, celestial mechanics. Hooke's astronomical inquiries led him deeper into the mechanics of planetary motion. He proposed that the motion of celestial bodies could be explained by gravitational attraction. Gravity follows a mathematical rule, possibly inverse square. Orbits are the result of centripetal forces. In his 1674 publication, An Attempt to Prove the Motion of the Earth, Hooke argued that the Earth rotated on its axis. The Earth revolved around the Sun. These motions could explain stellar parallax, planetary retrograde, and tides. He performed experiments to detect parallax, the tiny shifts in star position due to Earth's motion, but his instruments were not yet sensitive enough. Still, he laid the conceptual groundwork for what would later become Newtonian physics. The invisible war with Newton. Hooke and Newton's relationship grew increasingly sour. Hooke believed Newton had used his ideas on gravity and centripetal force without acknowledgement, ignored Hooke's contributions to planetary motion, dismissed his experimental approach as inferior to mathematical proofs. Newton, in turn, saw Hooke as petty and jealous, too imprecise and too emotional, a man who guessed but did not prove. Their feud shaped scientific politics for decades. When Newton published the Principia Mathematica, Hooke's name was not mentioned. Hooke protested bitterly. He believed he had planted the seed of celestial mechanics, and Newton had simply watered it. History now acknowledges Hooke's independent and prior insights, even if he lacked Newton's mathematical tools. The weight of the heavens. Despite the tension, Hooke's work in astronomy remained grounded in one principle. The laws of nature are universal. He saw no divide between the force that bent a spring and the one that bent a planet's path, the vibration of sound and the motion of light, the earth beneath his feet and the stars above his telescope. In all there was structure, motion, and proportion. He envisioned the universe not as mystical, but mechanicala grand machine whose parts were waiting to be revealed. And while he never published a great astronomical treatise, his drawings, lectures, and debates formed a foundation others would build upon. The astronomer remembered. Hooke's name rarely appears in modern lists of great astronomers. His contributions were overshadowed by Newton, Huygens, and Galileo. But in his own time, Hooke sketched some of the earliest accurate lunar maps, described Jupiter's surface dynamics, anticipated the motion of comets, proposed wave optics, theorized planetary gravity. attempted to measure parallax, designed architectural telescopes. He bridged the gap between the old metaphysical heavens and the new mechanical cosmos. The man who looked at fleas also looked at stars, and in both he saw the same divine machinery. Part 8. Rebuilding London. A City in Ashes. On the night of the 2nd of September, 1666, a fire broke out in a bakery on Pudding Lane, near the northern end of London Bridge. What began as a small blaze quickly turned into a firestorm. Fanned by dry timber, narrow alleys, and strong winds, the Great Fire of London raged for 4 days. It devoured over 13,000 homes, nearly 90 churches, including the great St. Paul's Cathedral, numerous public buildings, halls, shops, and businesses. By the time the flames were extinguished, more than 400 acres of the city lay in ruins. London was not just burned, it was erased, and from the ashes a new city had to rise. The scientific city surveyor. Amid the smoke and debris, 2 figures emerged as essential to the city's future. Christopher Wren, the architect and astronomer, Robert Hooke, the scientist, engineer, and now city surveyor. In 1666, Hooke was appointed surveyor to the City of London and chief assistant to the commissioners for rebuilding. His task was monumental: redesign and remeasure plots of land, rebuild lost buildings with new materials and better spacing, survey streets, and ensure fire-resistant construction, balance engineering efficiency with architectural elegance. But this wasn't just a technical job, it was an urban resurrection, one grounded in both science and civic imagination. Hooke the builder. Though better known for microscopes and springs, Hooke's architectural mind was formidable. He applied his understanding of mechanics to structural stability, his knowledge of materials science to prevent collapse and fire, his eye for geometry and proportion to street design and facades. Hooke designed or assisted in the construction of public buildings, market halls, libraries, city offices, churches, working with Wren on more than 50 across London, private homes, introducing wider streets, brick walls, and fire breaks, bridges and vaults, experimenting with arches, domes, and trusses. He insisted that London be not just restored but reimagined. The Monument to the Fire. One of Hooke's most enduring works was the Monument to the Great Fire, built in collaboration with Wren. Standing 202 feet tall, the monument marks the exact distance from the site of the fire's origin. Its design was both a memorial etched with historical inscriptions, a scientific instrument doubling as a zenith telescope and gravity experiment shaft. Hooke designed it so the vertical shaft could track celestial objects, a plumb line could measure Earth's gravitational pull, temperature readings, and barometric pressure could be recorded within. It was a towering symbol of resilience, but also a temple of rational investigation. The hidden mathematics of architecture. Hooke believed that architecture was not merely aestheticity, was applied physics. He studied the distribution of stress in arches and domes, the elastic behavior of materials under weight, load-bearing tolerances of wood, brick, and stone, how curved parabolas, catenaries, could strengthen structures. One of Hooke's most famous insights was his inverted chain principle. As hangs the flexible line, so but inverted will stand the rigid arch. This principle later helped shape the domes of St. Paul's Cathedral and other major buildings. It's a rule still taught in structural engineering today. Hooke saw no divide between geometry, science, and art. They were expressions of the same truth: London's new order. Hooke also played a critical role in urban planning. He proposed widening streets to reduce fire risk, introduced building regulations for material use and chimney placement, helped create uniform facades and coherent property divisions, developed more logical street layouts, replacing medieval chaos. Hooke's surveys were so detailed that disputes over land ownership plentiful in the fire's aftermath, were often resolved by referencing his precise measurements and maps. He worked tirelessly, sometimes surveying 20 to 30 plots a day, walking the broken city in boots thick with ash and soot, notebook in hand. He rebuilt London one line at a time. The collaboration with Wren, Hooke and Sir Christopher Wren formed one of history's most productive scientific duos, despite occasional rivalry. Wren had vision, charm, and political finesse. Hooke had technical brilliance and uncompromising logic. Together they designed and built dozens of churches, including St. Bride's, St. Mary Le Bow, and St. Benet's, rebuilt Gresham College, home of the Royal Society, laid out new street plans for damaged boroughs, explored the acoustics of domes and vaulted ceilings, advanced ideas of urban sanitation and airflow. Their greatest joint triumph would be St. Paul's Cathedral, with its soaring dome, mathematically refined by Hooke's arch principles. The man who measured a city. While others argued in Parliament or court, Hooke worked. His life became a whirlwind of lectures at Gresham College, daily surveying, architectural drafts and revisions, scientific demonstrations. His house on Gresham grounds became a workshop, laboratory, and drafting room. Instruments covered every surface. He barely slept. He was often overlooked in architectural accolades, with credit going to Wren, but the foundations, measurements, and designs were often Hooke's. In a very real sense, Hooke rebuilt London. Fire, geometry, and memory. Though Hooke's architecture lacked the grand ornamentation of Baroque contemporaries, it stood out for its symmetry, functionality, resilience, scientific elegance. Many of his buildings have not survived, replaced, or modified over centuries, but his ideas, fire-safe construction, street logic, scientific design endure. In stone and steel, Hooke brought science down from the stars and into the very bones of a city. His work after the fire was not just physical, it was philosophical. From destruction, he built order. From ash, he raised a city aligned not just with kings and bishops, but with natural law. The city as a living machine. Hooke believed that cities, like bodies, had skeletons, infrastructure, organs, markets, churches, schools, circulatory systems, roads and rivers, and needed healing when injured. He applied his worldview experimental, mechanistic rationale to an urban scale. In rebuilding London, he treated the city like an organism governed by physics and logic. He wanted London to be not only safer and stronger, but smarter. And in many ways, he succeeded. Part 9. Philosophy, Conflict, and Legacy. The Restless Mind. Robert Hooke never stopped thinking. Even after decades of discovery in biology, physics, astronomy, architecture, his mind remained in perpetual motion. He rose before dawn. He scribbled ideas between street surveys. He lectured in the evening and sketched late into the night. His notebooks, now scattered or lost, once overflowed with questions, equations, speculations, diagrams, unpublished inventions. There was no boundary between science and self. For Hooke, to exist was to inquire. But as he aged, his world began to narrow, not in thought, but in recognition. Hooke's philosophy of nature. Unlike Descartes or Newton, Hooke was not a metaphysician. He was a mechanical empiricist. He believed all natural phenomena could be explained by motion and matter. Invisible forces had measurable consequences. Life, light, gravity, heat were all natural effects, not spiritual mysteries. Observation and experiment must come before theory. In his own words, I am not of their mind who imagine that philosophy is to be built upon ideas. I think it ought to be founded on experience. Hooke saw nature not as a divine script, but as a machine complex, elegant, and discoverable. This worldview made him a bridge between medieval wonder and Enlightenment rationalism. Friends and foes. Hooke had few intimate friends. He was brilliant but impatient, sensitive yet argumentative, generous with ideas but suspicious of being copied. His professional circle included Christopher Wren, friend and architectural collaborator; Robert Boyle, mentor but eventually distant; John Wilkins, supporter from Oxford days; Thomas Sprat, historian of the Royal Society; Isaac Newton, ultimate rival. Hooke felt betrayed by many. He believed his contributions were undercredited, his ideas stolen or ignored. Though many admired his genius, few enjoyed his company. The war with Newton? The most defining conflict of Hooke's life was with Isaac Newton. Their tension ignited over the theory of light. Hooke favored wave theory. Newton, particle, gravitation. Hooke claimed he'd suggested inverse square attraction. Priority disputes. Hooke believed Newton built on his foundations without acknowledgement. When Newton published Principia Mathematica, 1687, Hooke was infuriated. His name appeared nowhere, despite years of correspondence. Hooke accused Newton of erasure. Newton dismissed Hooke as an experimentalist who lacked mathematical rigor. The feud consumed Hooke in his final years. It was not just a clash of intellects, but of identities. Hooke, the mechanic, the tinkerer, the builder; Newton, the mathematician, the abstractor, the prince of reason. The Royal Society turns cold. Hooke was once the lifeblood of the Royal Society, but with Newton's rise to prominence, Hooke's influence waned. When Newton became president of the Society in 1703, the same year, Hooke died. The institution turned fully toward mathematical physics, leaving Hooke's empirical tradition behind. Under Newton's leadership, Hooke's portrait was removed or destroyed. His name was omitted from revised society histories. His papers were scattered, his models lost. It was a systematic forgetting, and it nearly succeeded. For centuries, Hooke's reputation faded into shadow. The invisible legacy. Ironically, the man who saw what no one else could sell's elasticity, lunar craters, became invisible in history. Why? He lacked a grand, unified theory. He published less informal books. He alienated powerful allies. He was practical in a world turning abstract. He died without a preserved portrait or monument, yet his fingerprints remained everywhere. In biology textbooks, in engineering formulas, in modern clocks, in the skyline of London, his contributions were foundational, even if his name was not. The search for recognition. In the 20th and 21st centuries, scholars began to recover Hooke's legacy. They uncovered surviving notebooks with his daily experiments, references in Boyle's and Wren's papers, accounts of Royal Society meetings, diagrams and engravings from micrographia. Biographers reconstructed his image, a man of profound intellect, deep emotion, and turbulent humanity. And today, Hooke is finally remembered as the father of microscopy, a co-founder of elasticity theory, an early architect of gravitational mechanics, a builder of London, a visionary scientist in nearly every field he touched. Final years in solitude. In the last years of his life, Hooke lived increasing isolation. He suffered from chronic pain, memory lapses, insomnia, increasing bitterness, but he kept working. His final notebook entries, written in a trembling hand, still speculated on light, air, heat, and life. He died on the 3rd of March, 1703, at the age of 67, in a room filled with instruments and silence. He left no children, no statue, no grave bearing his name. But he left a world that had been changed. The philosopher's message. If Hooke had one enduring message, it was this: look closer. He believed the universe was knowable not through intuition, but through labor, through careful eyes, precise instruments, and relentless curiosity. He invited us not to accept, but to question, not to imagine, but to observe. and not to worship nature blindly, but to unravel its secrets, one detail at a time. Legacy through others. Robert Hooke's ideas lived on through those who stood on his shoulders. Isaac Newton, who completed the laws of motion, Christian Huygens, who advanced optics, Antony van Leeuwenhoek, who expanded microbiology, Michael Faraday, who continued experimental natural philosophy, James Clerk Maxwell, who completed Hooke's wave theory of light. Hooke was a thread in the grand fabric of modern science, a thread hidden for centuries yet woven deep into the pattern. Part 10. The Forgotten Genius Remembered. The Echo in Silence. After Robert Hooke died in 1703, the world went quiet about him. There was no public funeral, no monument, no portrait left behind. His remains were interred without fanfare in the church of St. Helen, Bishopsgate. In time, even his name disappeared from textbooks. Other scientists, many of whom built on his work, were celebrated. Newton was knighted and buried in Westminster Abbey. Boyle was hailed as the father of chemistry. Huygens, Leibniz, Halley, they became giants of thought. Hooke became a ghost. His notebooks vanished. His contributions were scattered, often uncredited. The man who once uncovered the unseen had himself become invisible. The science he left behind. And yet this science endured. Even when no one said Hooke, the things he gave the world were everywhere. In the springs inside every mechanical watch, in the term cell in every biology classroom, in the formulas of elasticity, engineers rely on, in the wave theory of light embraced centuries later, in the bridges, domes, and arches of great cities, in the telescopes that charted the stars. He was the quiet engineer of the modern world. Hooke's ideas didn't die. They simply lived under different names. Rediscovery begins. In the 20th century, scholars began to reopen the story of Hooke. Historians uncovered minutes from Royal Society meetings, surviving fragments of his journals, correspondence with Newton, Boyle, and Wren, copies of Micrographia, still stunning in their illustrations. Suddenly, the man who had been omitted from history books emerged again more complex, more brilliant, and more essential than anyone had realized. Modern historians now credit him as the first person to visualize and name the cell, the true originator of the law of elasticity, a co-architect of gravitational mechanics, one of the earliest scientific urban planners, the man who revolutionized observation itself, Micrographia's second life. Micrographia, Hooke's masterpiece, found a second life in modern times. Scientists and artists alike marveled at its microscopic detail, stunning illustrations, blend of art and science, deep curiosity about the structure of matter. The book is now taught in universities, celebrated in exhibits, and digitally preserved in archives around the world. In the age of electron microscopes and molecular biology, Hooke's humble cork slice those dead cell walls still stands as a foundational moment in science. He took what was invisible and gave it form. Monuments at last. Though Hooke had no portrait in his lifetime, modern artists and scientists sought to restore his face. In 2003, on the 300th anniversary of his death, the Royal Society finally unveiled a memorial plaque in his honor. A modern portrait was recreated based on descriptions, and Hooke's image returned to the walls of institutions he helped build. Other tributes followed. A lunar crater named Hooke, an asteroid bearing his name, Hooke Court, a historic home where he once lived, preserved. Hooke's law taught to millions of students, streets and schools named for him across the UK. The ghost had become a monument. Lessons from a forgotten genius. Robert Hooke's story is more than one of science. It's a parable about the fragility of memory, the politics of recognition, the tension between theory and practice, the cost of challenging those in power, the pain of being brilliant but human. Hooke was not perfect. He was defensive, argumentative, prideful, but he was also tireless, relentlessly curious, loyal to evidence, ahead of his time. He reminds us that history doesn't always reward the most deserving, but that truth endures even in shadow. Hooke's mind in today's world, in a modern world of nanotechnology, genetic engineering, space exploration, urban megacities, timekeeping and precision tools, artificial intelligence. Robert Hooke's legacy surrounds us. His worldview empirical, mechanical, grounded in observationis, the beating heart of modern science. Every time a microscope reveals a new species, every time a spring uncoils in a machine, every time we measure, test, observe, revise, Hooke's ghost smiles in the background. He made the invisible visible. The final notebook. Among the few pages of Hooke's journals that survive, there is a haunting passage. He wrote, "I am sensible that I am not esteemed, but I am satisfied that I have done my part." He wasn't seeking immortality. He sought truth. He sought to understand how things worked, to build bridges between what we could see and what we had not yet imagined. That is the truest legacy a scientist can leave. And Hooke left it everywhere. What we owe Robert Hooke. We owe Hooke the first glimpse of cells, the law of elasticity, the transformation of architecture through mechanics, the insight that force equals deformation, a bridge from observation to explanation, the blending of craft and concept. We owe him more than his name in a footnote. We owe him our curiosity. We owe him our willingness to look again, closer, deeper. The invisible made visible. Robert Hooke never received the fame of Newton, the reverence of Galileo, or the legend of Da Vinci, but he left behind a world more understandable, more measurable, and more open. His was a life of hard questions and harder answers, of invention without applause, of genius hidden in plain sight. Yet in every cell, every spring, every star we study, there echoes the work of the man who saw the invisible. Robert Hooke, the artist of science, the engineer of wonder, the forgotten genius finally remembered.